To me, it felt very, very real. In fact, it felt more real than this physical reality. It was as if my awareness was expanding more and more, like going through different levels, because after a while, I started to leave this physical level. And when we leave our physical body, we leave behind everything that's associated with our body, our biology, our voice, our race, our religion. All of that gets left behind. And what crosses over is just pure essence, pure spirit, or pure love. We can call it whatever we want. And so I started to encounter the essence or the spirit of other people who were familiar to me, like my dad, who had died 10 years ago. I felt his presence around me. And even though he wasn't in his physical body, I recognized him immediately. It was literally like his energy and my energy just merged. And I was like, oh, Dad, it's you. I just knew. And we're not even talking to each other. We don't need to explain who we are. We know what each other is feeling right away without words. My dad and I, when I was growing up, we had a very turbulent relationship because I rebelled against my culture. I come from a culture where women are considered second-class citizens. And so my dad and I clashed a lot, and I even ran away from an arranged marriage. So when he passed away, I had always thought that I had let him down, that I had disappointed him as a daughter. But now here he was on the other side with me, and all I felt from him was pure, unconditional love. And I felt he understood why I was the way I was. So it was just the most incredible feeling. I then felt that I was surrounded by other beings, and I didn't recognize them all from this life, but I did feel that I was just unconditionally loved by them and that they were there to protect me and help me. And I started to understand that I've always been protected, but not just me, we all are, but we don't realize it. We don't know this.
So I turned around to move back into the room. And then I realized something was really weird because I was looking into a PA speaker. Now this PA speaker was up near the ceiling, and I was looking directly into it. And I knew when I came into the hospital that that speaker was at least 3 feet above my head. So then I knew something was really strange. And I moved back into the room, and I looked down into the circle bed, and I saw my body. It didn't bother me. I was very peaceful. I was very calm. It was okay that she was down there and I was up where I was. The only thing I remember at that point was laughing because I had tape wrapped around my nose. It was just strange to see my body like that with this tape, and just hanging out with her for a while. It certainly wasn't me anymore. I had no problems with the separation. And then the next thing I knew, I was in total blackness. And I remember thinking, well, either my eyes aren't working or I'm in darkness. And as I thought that, I felt hands come around the back of me and pull me into this warm, soft, lush love, which was my grandmother. She had been dead for 14 years. Now, when she died, I thought that was it was over. I never gave much thought to the fact that when people were dead, they were dead. But I also had absolutely no doubt at that moment I was with my grandmother. And as I realized that, I also realized that everything I had ever believed was just a belief, that now I was in touch with reality. And reality was that my grandmother and I were together again. And as I thought that, it was like every memory we had of each other came alive again. And all this love that we had for each other just embraced us and was us.
And as I looked up, there was a tunnel, a light, an opening. And it was glowing. And around that opening were many people milling around. And it seemed to be one man kind of taking a turn at being in charge. And I could see that they were talking, and some noticed that I was coming. And there was concern among them. And they talked to this man, and he looked and saw me coming. And the next thing I knew, he floated up next to me. It's like I was coming this way, and he came right here. And we were both floating in this space. And it was so wonderful. It was so loving and calm and peaceful. It was wonderful. And he looked down at me, and he had a clipboard, and he looked like he was in street clothes, like a vest, sweater, and just kind of a regular kind of guy. And I knew him as Uncle. And I remember thinking, I don't have an uncle that looks like him. And he looked down at me and he said, "You're not supposed to be here. It's not time for you to be here." And I remember looking up at him and saying, "But I want to be here." And I had no conscious thoughts of where I'd come from or anything. I mean, it wasn't a matter of getting away or in lieu of. It was just, with all my heart, I wanted to be there. I wanted to come. I wanted to go home. And I was happy. And he took a pause, and he kind of, you could see him thinking about something and deciding whether to say something next. And with that, my memory, there was a picture placed in my head of a memory of my original agreement of why I had come to Earth to begin with. And it was like I remembered, and I went, "Oh, right, right."
And I went into anaphylactic shock. So one minute I was in the dentist chair, the next minute I was up on the ceiling looking down at this body. And as I looked at my 29-year-old body, I felt as though it was just a piece of clothing. I had a fondness for it. I knew it. I had used it well, but it was time to go to the Salvation Army. I wasn't connected to it. And I felt no fear, no pain, no anxiety. The dentist was kind of freaking out, and I was trying to talk to him from up there and say it was okay, but of course he didn't get it.
As if that would help.
And I had also within this, I had no sense of time. There was no anxiety. There was no sense of passing time. So I don't know how long I was up there in the corner. But the next thing I knew, it was as though I had turned around and I was going into a tunnel, and my mother, who had been dead for 15 years, was right at the tunnel. I can still see it. And she was beautiful and whole and vibrant and healthy, and she did not die that way. She was healed. And her arms were outstretched to me, and we communicated telepathically, so our mouths didn't move, but I thought, and she received, and she thought, and I heard. And I thought, "I miss you." And what came back to me was, "I know," as though her arms were around me. And I was not able to tell her I loved her before she died, and I said, "I love you." And she said, "I know." And my ego was not present, because my ego here would have said, I wanted to stay with my mother for years and years and years and tell her every single first date I had and my wedding and all about my child. The ego was not present because I knew from a soul level at that moment that she had always been with me. We had never been apart. I knew that. I still know that. And so with that, I was drawn into a tunnel that, to me, the words I can describe it are almost an opalescent blue, beautiful, beautiful. And at the end of the tunnel was a pinpoint of light, and I couldn't do anything but go toward it. And so I went toward this light, and as I got to this light, it became bigger and brighter, almost like looking into the sun, but it wasn't painful to look into this light. And the light was in front of me, and then the light was around me, and then I was in the light, and then I knew I was the light. That there, as a drop of water in the ocean is not separate, the light and I were made of the same substance. And I was home.
And then I looked out into the horizon and I could see the sun. But I saw the sun as if I'm looking through a telescope, and I could see the flares coming out of it. And And I felt that this wind that I was feeling was, giving birth there. And it was this warm air that was just coming to me. And that's why I was able to fly. That's what was giving me this lift, this warm air. And I'm thinking all these things, and I look down and I see this amazing cove, and I see a beach, and I see a man in the water. He's like knee deep in the water. And he's got 6 children holding onto his right hand in a string, right, in a line, and 1 child on his left hand. And I said, wow, that's pretty amazing. Let me go down and see what that's all about. So I moved down, and maybe I'm about 10 feet, 15 feet away, and he turns around. That was my father. It was amazing to see him, but what was more amazing was that me and my father had a very, very hard relationship. We used to bump heads tremendously, and he used to drink, and he was quite abusive. And even though I was the 7th of 8 children, I became like my mother's protector. And so we had a lot of clashes, and I don't ever remember saying to my father in life that I love you, or he to me. And his ways were very strict. So we couldn't hug. That wasn't what men do. It was like he had this image of men being like empty, without a soul, without feelings, wow. What an opportunity to say to my father what I could never say to him in life. And so we had this exchange that was very emotional to me. But I understood that he loved me. And I think he understood that I loved him. So it kind of reunited us in a strange way. Not only did we meet there, but from a more spiritual perspective, we became one. Anyway, after all this amazing time, he looks at me and he says, look, you have to go back. And I'm looking at him and I said, no, I don't think so. I really like it here. He's like, no, you got to go back. It's not your time. And I'm looking at him like, no, I want to stay. And then I felt this tugging, like in my chest, but coming from my back. And I started being pulled. And I went back into my body. I opened my eyes, and the doctor that was doing CPR, she kind of got surprised, and she kind of lifted her head back a little. And then I went right back to my father, and I was in this space again. And he's looking at me, he says, no, you really don't get it, you have to come back. And he said, look, this is what we're going to do. So we kind of started to structure a deal in heaven. And he said to me, look, when it's your time, I promise I will come and get you. And I looked at him and I'm thinking, wow, what an amazing deal that is. How could I say no? And so I accepted that. And I went back. When you have your experience of dying, you get this interconnectivity. You feel like you're connected to everything. So that sense of oneness is really profound. When you come back into your physical body again, you feel that sense of separation. So there's something about being in body that makes us feel like we're independent of the rest of the world.
So what moved me through this place of transition where some people were not moving, was the great love that I had for the love of all loves, for the love of all beauties. To me, the love of God. And as I moved through this, I wondered, as I came to the end of it, if I would be alone. And then instantly, though the thought and the reality were one and the same, instantly I was merged with an uncle of mine who had passed on a year and a half before. And instantly I was everything that he was, and he was everything that I was and knew, and I was aware of things that I couldn't have been aware of in this life about my uncle. It was a very joyous reunion. It was as if we were two lights that had come together and blended as a single light. And I became aware that he was a person of great courage, although to look at him in this life, he was obviously a very impressive, very tall, regal-looking individual with a classic, Native American features and whatnot. But he was a very humble, although he was educated and whatnot, he was a very humble persona. But I realized that he was a person of tremendous courage, and that this courage was very, almost unspeakably great in him, and it was not something that one could ever judge physically in this life. Looking at the way that he lived his life, one wouldn't say that he was a courageous person, but I realized that he was one of the great heroes. Sometime later, my mother explained something to me that I wasn't aware of that makes sense to me now. But although this was very joyous, this union with my uncle, to instantly be aware of everything that he was and knew and could be spiritually and intellectually and emotionally, my attraction really was for the love of all loves, for this great magnetic pull that I felt. And I moved through him, and I became aware also that he was quite shocked that I was there, because my mother could not endure my death at that point in time. But I also knew that everything was as it should be.
More about who I was, all kinds of different lives I've led, all kinds of things that I'd done. And still I was part of. I could have just merged and blended into that love, because that's what I was made of. And the next cool thing was that I saw all of my dead relatives. That was really cool on so many levels, because my mother had died of cancer when I was 12 years old. And she was the first one I saw. It always makes me cry when I think of that, because she looked very young, younger than I ever knew her, alive and happy. And I'm always so happy to share this with people, especially people who have lost loved ones recently. I'm always envious when I hear that somebody went home. I really am. I feel horrible for the people who have lost a loved one, but I'm always happy. I'm so happy and envious about the person who went home, because I know where they're going. They're at peace. They're in love in a way that most people can't understand. It's unbelievable. So here was my mother and 2 grandmothers and 2 grandfathers and a lot of aunts and uncles, and they all looked so good, and they were all so happy. And they just conveyed to me that, they had been watching over me. My mother had been watching over me my whole life. And, there were some things in the 60s I wasn't so happy that she might have seen, but she didn't care, because there's no judgment there. There is no judgment. None whatsoever. That's the second most important, or one of the most important things I learned. God does not judge us. I was there in the heart of God, which is what all of us are. I had returned to the heart of God, and I knew that I was not judged at all. They were so proud of me. What courage it took to do that. What courage it took to be on planet Earth, pretending to be human, pretending to be separate, willingly muffling our connection to all that is, pretending that we're flawed and limited. What courage that takes. They were amazing. And I'm standing there like, well, I've never done anything important. They said, oh, you've done the most important thing that exists. It was wonderful. The next coolest thing was I saw these people in the back. I had never met them on planet Earth, but I instantly knew who they were. They were my biological parents. Because I was given up for adoption as an infant. My adoptive parents got me when I was about 6 weeks old. I mean, I probably saw my mother for, but I sure didn't remember her. There she was. And my father, and my grandparents. And I knew immediately who they were. And, every adoptive child, the only question they have, question I had my whole life, was why? Why did he give me up? Was I not good enough? Well, of course, anyone who's ever arranged an adoption for a child knows that that's not it. It's because they've made this incredible sacrifice so the child can have a better life than they can provide. But I didn't even have to ask the question because I knew immediately. That it was all done out of love, and even more important, before any of us had been born on this earth for that lifetime, we had arranged it. I had said, I want to learn what it's like. I want to work on self-love. So in order to work on the lesson of self-love, I had to arrange a lot of rejection. How can you learn self-love if the people around you don't reject you? Or at least you have to be able to perceive that. And I said, well, that's one of the biggest rejections a person could ever feel. So let's do that. So some of my dear friends on a soul level said, well, it'll be hard, but I'll help you. I'll play that role for you. So we do this when we have hard things in our lives. Sometimes instead of judging it, if we look first at what can this teach me and what can I learn from this situation, we can find that piece of gold inside, because there's always a piece of gold inside. So here I am, I have my adoptive mother and my other adopted family members who had already died, and I have my biological family. And it was such a, and they knew each other already, it was such a wonderful reunion for all of us.
Now I was in this loving presence of God for perhaps a nanosecond of time, perhaps an eternity. It is another ineffable problem, trying to describe time in that realm, because time and space, as we know it here, has no meaning on the other side. Now, for the rest of the experience, I would like you to think back to the last time you had a very vivid dream. And in that dream, you were in a particular dream sequence with particular people, and all of a sudden, without any transition, you were in another sequence with other people, and each of these experiences was just as vivid, and you can remember them. It would have to be a very recent dream for you to be able to remember this. I am describing an experience that took place 17 years ago, and I can remember every part of that experience in detail. Now, when the first transition came, I was suddenly floating down with my friend still at my side. We were still out in the universe, and we were in the celestial amphitheater, as I describe it in my book. And as we floated down and I looked out, I saw all my spiritual brothers and sisters, and they were all greeting me with waves of energy. And I realized indeed this was my home. These were my brothers and sisters. And when I looked up to the right side, very close to me, I saw family members and friends and loved ones who had passed on before me. and they greeted me more closely. And indeed, this was my home. These were my spiritual brothers and sisters. This was the perfect family that I had always longed for in my life. The experience was like being at every birth, every birthday, every graduation ceremony, every wedding, every reunion, every celebration in a perfect family, because that's where I was, and that's what I was experiencing.
And they rolled me on my side, and he said, "This is going to hurt a lot." In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom. I could see myself hovering on the ceiling, but I couldn't really see me because I was, I guess, in spirit form. But I could look down and see Peter Anthony, meaning Peter was looking down at Peter, but I could see Peter. And all these doctors were just going in this medical protocol. And the tunnel began to rotate and rotate, and for me, what happened, I felt as though something had attached itself to my solar plexus, but not Peter on the table, Peter hovering over the operating table. And I felt as though it was being vacuumed into this tunnel. And for me, the most incredible thing was that there were people, family members and relatives and friends were greeting me there at this rotating tunnel, but they weren't my current brother and sister and my father and my aunt and uncle and grandmother and grandparents of that lifetime, of that current lifetime who had died. These were all past life people that were there greeting me to come into this tunnel. And I knew who they were, and they were smiling.
And I remember the top of my head tingling, and I just sort of popped out of the top of my head. And I was then looking down at the body. I knew it was my body, but I didn't care. My vantage point was sort of sitting on the doctor's shoulder. I felt a presence. I sort of turned around to look at it, and that's when I saw the very tiny pinpoint of light. And the light started to pull me. And there was a physical sensation to the pulling, and I know how that must sound. Nonetheless, it's true. There was a physical sensation, rather like going over a hill real fast. Tell me. And I went toward the light. The closer I got to the light, I began to discern different figures, different people, and I distinctly heard my grandmother call me. She has a very distinct voice. And I immediately went to her. And it felt great. And I saw an uncle who passed away when he was only 39 years old. He taught me a lot. He taught me to play my first guitar. And I saw many, many people I knew and many, many I didn't know. But I knew that I was somehow in some way connected to them. I asked if God was the light. And the answer was no, God is not the light. The light is what happens when God breathes. And I distinctly remember thinking, I'm standing in the breath of God. At some point in time, I was reminded that it was time to go back. Of course, I had made my decision to go back before I ever laid down on that table. But, you know, the more I was there, the better I liked it. And my uncle was the one who brought me back down to the body. But then I got to where the body was, and I looked at the thing, and I for sure did not want to get in it, because it looked pretty much like what it was, as in void of life. And I knew it would hurt, so I didn't want to get in. And he kept reasoning with me. He says, it's like diving into a swimming pool, just jump in. No. What about the children? You know what? I think the children will be fine. honey, you've got to go. No. He pushed me. He gave me a little help there. It's taken a long time, but I think I'm ready to forgive him for that.
And then everything transitioned into this beautiful landscape where there's a quote that I love by Thomas More, and it said, "There is no pain on earth that heaven can't heal." And what I felt like is everything that was dead was now alive. So my grandfather showed up and he looked beautiful. He had died in his 70s, but in heaven, he just was glowing with light, and he came towards me. He had this look in his eye that communicated with telepathy, much like the angels, and we spent some time together. And I saw this light farther away that kind of looked like a sun. And he very quickly said, "Do you want to go there?" And I said, "Yes." And my soul just flew towards this light. And as I got closer to that light, everything that had been painful in my childhood, the poverty, the neglect, the emotional abuse, all of that seemed to wash away. That wasn't your fault. You're loved, you're perfect, you're fine. You're a child of God, you are loved completely. Earlier in the near-death experience, I had heard "be like a little child," and at that moment, I felt like a little child. I felt like I was loved deeply by God. Nothing could harm me. I felt completely free, and I didn't want to leave that realm because you can't imagine that love. It's so intense, and we don't feel anything like it here. We feel glimpses of it here. Loving a child, loving your parents, loving, your spouse, it's all just it's not the same. This is complete, and those are just pieces is the only way I can describe it.
When I got to the light, the love was so incredible, the acceptance, the forgiveness. There was pure knowledge. I knew everything, and I knew everything was going to be okay. And when I first got there, I was greeted by someone to my side, and it was a man, and he was dressed in a robe. And he showed me over to my side, there was a long table. And at this table were thousands and thousands of people on either side of the table talking and chatting and conversing and having a good time and laughing. And everyone was having a party-like atmosphere. And I remember when I looked at the table, instantly one person turned and looked straight at me and caught me in the eye, and it was my grandmother. And she said to me, she goes, "You can't stay here, it's not your time yet." And I instantly said, I'm not leaving, I'm staying. I love it here. I'm accepted here for what I am. I'm forgiven for everything I had ever done. And I did not want to leave for any reason.
I'm on the other side, and I'm sitting on a bright white stone bench overlooking valleys for as far as the eye can see of flowers. And the colors, some we know and some are not of this earth. And they're all vibrating with an energy, the flowers. And I'm sitting with this presence next to me. I would have guessed maybe early 30s just by looking at the presence. But telepathically, we were enjoying what we were seeing. And then that presence told me that he was my brother Michael. And at that moment, there was an energy that went through my body and through my heart that I describe in the book, and I don't think it gives it justice, that it was like the explosion of 1,000 suns exploding, and I didn't want it to stop.
I headed up towards the light, and the light was so bright, but it doesn't hurt your eyes. It's a beautiful, radiant light that I went up, and as I stepped through that light, there were green pastures and brilliant flowers everywhere. And I remember turning to my left and looking at all these beings that were in line to want to come back to this earth. And they were all so happy, and I couldn't understand, why are they so happy to come back to this earthly plane? I had just left there, and I was so glad to be up, being in this light, being free, being home. And it was at that moment I turned and looked, and there were the dogs and cats running so free and happy through the fields. And it made my heart just so warm because I have such a love for animals. Next thing I knew it, off to my right comes up this beautiful, young, radiant woman. She looked familiar to me, but I thought, how could she be familiar to me? I don't know who she is. And she said, Catherine. I said, yes. She said, I'm your grandmother, Catherine. And I thought, how could you be so familiar to me? Because she had committed suicide before I was born. She continued to tell me what her life was about and what led up to her suicide and what happened after. And after that, I had gone through my own life review.
I found myself in just an incredibly beautiful meadow, just flowers and foliage that were just colors beyond belief. And I was on a pathway walking down. There was a stone archway that I could see down at the bottom of this pathway, where there was this light that was emanating from it that was drawing me to it. And the thing that I found interesting was that everything was interconnected, that the plants, the flowers were communicating with me and I was communicating back. We were all at the same plane. I mean, nothing was at a higher level, nothing was at a lower level. Everything just seemed to be communicating and connected.
Yeah.
And so as I went down this pathway, I entered through this stone archway, and it was just a beautiful garden in there. And as I entered into there, my dad was ahead of me.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad had actually passed away 6 years before I had my accident.
Yeah.
He looked wonderful to me. He looked, just at the prime of his life. He looked very happy. He came up, he embraced me, and I had communicated to him, I said I was really lost and confused. I mean, I knew that I either had died or I was in the process of dying.
Yeah.
And when I told him that I was really confused, it was really more about, what was going to happen with me, because I didn't want to deal with what I knew was ahead of me.
Yeah.
And my dad embraced me, and he just said, you're not going to be lost or confused any longer, but you need to go back. It's not your time. When it is, I'll be here for you.
There was a path that I was moving on, and there's people to the left that were just congregating. They were just gathering. In fact, it looked like a few of them were just getting in place just as I arrived. And it made me think, rightfully so, I found out, that they were getting there to welcome me, to be there just when I needed them to be there. And I looked at these wonderful people that were brilliantly lit with their bright eyes and great smiles with genuine hearts. By the way, all of the light is still coming from God, through the wall, through the people, through me. And these people were, at this point, I saw family later, but at this point it was important, I think, that God had me welcomed by the most wonderful, loving, kindest people ever. And yet none were what we would call blood family. And when I discussed this quickly through my heart to my guides, the information came to me very quickly from heart to head that this was my real family. This was my spiritual family. These are my brothers. These are my sisters. And everybody was about the same age. Nobody was old or decrepit. There was nothing wrong with anybody. No scars. So hide mine here. And everybody looked about your age, if I may say.
No. 30.
I joked to them
we want 30.
But yeah, they
29 is what I'm going for.
Yeah, I'll go with that. But yeah, they looked around to 30-ish, in that era. And it was clear that the most important family is my spiritual brothers and sisters, and there's millions, hundreds of millions. If you don't have family, you will love heaven because you have millions waiting for you. And others have family in heaven already. And the great news about that is we'll be able to connect again and have this wonderful fellowship with our family from the blood. But the blood family on earth is not like it is in heaven. We're all blood family.
The last thing I remember is taking my foot off the brake, and I was coasting through the intersection, and then the next thing I knew, I was in a different place. It was kind of like sheer material all around me. It was a light, and it was like a golden color, and it was kind of like what I think of as being in a cocoon. It was really warm, and I could see someone just on the other side of the material, or on the outside of the cocoon, that I knew was my dad. After it seemed like I had been there for quite a while, I remember looking down to my left and looking, pretty far down, and I could see my family. They each, had their own combination of colors that were, like swirling around their bodies and yet coming out in rays. And that was when I knew that it was time to go back. And the next thing that I knew, then I was waking up and the nurses were telling me that I had been in a wreck.
And I had a thought, where am I going? And all of a sudden, this little medium-sized star said, this is where you're going. And I was in the star going through the tunnel of light. And that tunnel of light, as I was going in it, I was hearing music. People were greeting me, hi, welcome, welcome. And then I saw my mother. And I thought, well, why is my mother here? She's alive down on earth. But she was there greeting me. And that puzzled me a lot. But I kept going through the light, and I said, no, I need to get to the light. The urge to get back to the source was so strong, I didn't care about anything else.
There was simply this matter-of-fact realization, I am now dying. But there was no negative thought or hard feelings whatsoever associated with this. It wasn't even related to this feeling we often have in life when confronted with a sudden death. It wasn't anything like this, but simply, I'm leaving now. I was given an opportunity to say farewell to all material, all worldly things. Then I was stopped in my tracks and reminded that I am now consciously saying goodbye to my loved ones, but that I'd have all the time in the world to do so. I then perceived one person after another, one at a time, but not in the way that they actually were, and where they physically were at that moment, but I perceived them as a hologram, like a hovering soul. I very consciously said farewell to each and every one of them. While I was doing that, I became aware of what an immense shock this would be for them. And then the thought came to my mind that they would soon learn of my death. and how very difficult this would be for them. On one hand, I knew at this moment that it was okay for me to leave. On the other hand, I also knew how hard this would be on them, since they had had no opportunity to see me off. Maybe they still had something they felt they needed to share with me, or something they would have liked to hear from me. But I was quite certain that everything was perfectly fine now. This was how it was supposed to be. And yet, I knew it would be very hard on them. But regardless, it was absolutely fine, and I knew I had all the time in the world for this process of saying farewell. This companion didn't say anything like, "Come on, get on with it." I simply knew that I had as much time as I needed for this. When I had completed this process of saying goodbye, I turned to my companion and very consciously stated, "If now is the time, I am ready to go."